Thank you so much for being with us. Please welcome our special guest, John Kerry, U.S. Special Presidential Envoy for Climate. Thank you. Secretary Kerry, thank you so much.
Sorry.
Thank you so much for joining me here.
I'm happy to join you.
On CNBC. Secretary Kerry, I have to ask you, of course, the theme here at the World Economic Forum is cooperation in a fragmented world. Fighting the climate crisis. Is cooperation realistic, given the partisan differences that we're seeing not only in the US, but around the world?
Well, first of all, thank you. I'm privileged to be here. Yes, of course it's possible. I mean, there's no reason in the world. And there is a remarkable amount of cooperation. I mean, I think I just came from a meeting moments ago with Marina Silva, the new Minister for Environment in Brazil, talking about our agenda for the Amazon. And that was preceded by a meeting with the Minister of Environment from Ghana, who is co-chairing with me a major group of countries that have come together to try to work on the Indonesia forest, the Congo, and the Amazon. So there's an incredible amount of cross-pollination taking place, I think. I just came from a conference in the UAE on sustainability with people from all walks of life and different companies, all of whom, yeah, there's competition, but there's also a sense that we're all in this together, and we've really got to up the game. We've got to accelerate the reduction of emissions, but also accelerate the other key components of getting to neutrality and of doing this in a way that is just and doesn't leave the global south behind and so forth. It's a very complicated but exciting process.
Of course, China's vice premier is here at Davos too. Have you spoken to him yet? And what are relations like now between the US and China, a very important relationship in this fight?
Well, no, I know that he is here. I've not yet had a chance to either bump into him or see him, but I'd be happy to. I mean, it'd be something that I would want to do. I have resumed, and the United States has resumed formal discussions with the Chinese. We've had several meetings to date, and we'll be talking very shortly. We will be meeting again soon. And we very much hope to be able to find the pathway to a breakthrough that could make a huge difference, since China is, of course, 30% of all the global emissions, and the United States is at about 10 now. And we are on a pathway, however, to keep the warming of the planet limited to the 1.5 degrees, together with a bunch of other countries. But we need more countries to be joining that group. But I am encouraged that there are major technologies on which we are poised to have a breakthrough. There's a tremendous global effort taking place. There's much more awareness. I find we're not in a battle now to convince as many people that this is happening and you have to change. We're in a mobilization effort and a new moment, I think, for the movement, because people are finally beginning to really see what the implications are of not taking action.
And of course, COP27 ended with an agreement to provide loss and damage funding for the poorer countries hit hard by climate change. But the details are still unknown. How much is the fund worth, and where would the finance come from?
Well, those questions are legitimate, but they were all left specifically to the process this year to try to provide the answers to those things. It is appropriate that people are really focused on the consequences of this crisis that we're facing. And there are many countries in the world, the most vulnerable nations, that are not responsible for what is happening, but who are getting the impacts full on. And so, I mean, it's meaningful that in Africa, for instance, in sub-Saharan Africa, there are 48 nations that equal in total 0.55% of all the emissions. But then on the other side, you have 20 major economies that are responsible for 80% of all the emissions. So you don't have to work hard unless you have no heart and no brain to understand the degree to which justice is critical, inclusivity is critical, and action is critical, urgent action to begin to reduce those emissions fast enough that we do what the scientists are telling us we must do, which is avoid the worst consequences of the crisis. And we only avoid the worst consequences if we can hold the Earth's temperature increase to the 1.5 degrees. And we're on the edge. There are some scientists who will tell you you've already blown past it. There are some who will tell you, no, we may be able to have a little overshoot, but we can do a clawback and come back to hold on to the 1.5. All I know is we're not on track to hit the 1.5. We should be, we need to be, we need to do everything in our power to move in that direction. That means a whole bunch of things. Beginning to be much faster in our transition to the new clean economy, being much more strict in holding each other accountable to the reduction of emissions, getting reduction targets from certain big countries that haven't even renewed their targets as they were meant to post-Glasgow. So there are a whole set of imperatives here for what has to be done.
What happens if we don't?
Well, we're seeing some of what happens when you don't. We had 18 over $1 billion climate events in the United States in the last year. We're seeing in California now the record level of flooding after the consequence of a disruption that's taken place. There are 10 million people who die every year now on this planet because of extreme heat. There are 15 million people who die every year because of the lack of air quality that comes from the pollution, which is greenhouse gases. You can see consequences all over the world. 30 million people in Pakistan in one event of flooding, which was unprecedented in its force. And so not everything is exclusively the result of the climate crisis, but it is absolutely to a certainty augmented by the climate crisis. Why do we know that? Because the warming of the planet, 90% of that warming goes into the ocean. The ocean is warmer. With a greater, warmer ocean, you have rising levels of moisture, and that goes into the atmosphere and creates temperature gradients and intensity in the storms that we face today. So, science, what we're dealing with is not sort of a pet project of President Biden or of EU or other developed countries. It is the consequence of what physics, science, mathematics tell us is happening because of choices we are either making or not making. And so it has the potential of catastrophic consequences on a global basis if food production is interrupted to such a degree that hundreds of millions or tens of millions of people are moving to a place where they can actually survive, all at the same time. So if people thought migration was a massive impact on the planet during the years of the Syrian war, for instance, when they were piling into Europe, and look at the impact that had on the politics of Europe, and is still having. If you think politics was changed by that, wait till you see what happens when food production in Africa is completely disrupted, or when places that are today livable become unlivable. Now, I'm not a I'm not a Cassandra on this. All of this is manageable. All of this is subject to choices that we could be making today in order to avoid those worst consequences. The scientists have put it to us, and it's the responsibility of people in public office around the world, but also the responsibility of corporate leaders, other folks, community leaders, and even kids in school and elsewhere. And in fact, I think we should all be pretty grateful for the intensity with which young people around the planet have brought a demand for responsibility from people who are supposed to be behaving like adults.
Talking of politics, Secretary Kerry, President Biden, you mentioned, who's committed to fighting climate change. But depending on who's in power, of course, we saw former President Trump take America out of the Paris Agreement. 2024, the election coming up in the U.S., how worried are you? And what happens if there is a change of government who are not committed?
Well, let me be. I'll give you my opinion. That's the best I can do because you can't predict the future with certainty. But I'm about as certain about this as I could be after years and years of being in public service. I do not believe any one politician or any one country could turn around what is happening on the planet today with respect to a response to climate. You have unbelievable amount of investment now taking place in new technologies. You have people moving to green hydrogen, you're moving to direct air carbon capture or carbon capture utilization and storage. People are, there are about 70 new battery companies that have come into existence after the Inflation Reduction Act passed in the United States. There's a huge amount of explorative effort, innovation and creativity through something like breakthrough technology from Bill Gates. We're building a nuclear plant at the Idaho National Lab. Another one is being built by Bill Gates and his initiative in Wyoming. Small modular reactors are now being produced and thought of and designed. You're seeing an unbelievable amount of activity taking place, and that economic activity is a reflection of global decisions that have been made, not the decisions of one president or a Senate somewhere or a parliament. Ford Motor Company and General Motors have retooled their plants. They are only going to produce electric vehicles by 2035, and by 2030, 50% of the vehicles they produce will be electric. Do you think they're going to suddenly wake up one day because someone in the White House or elsewhere say, hey, I don't like this and it's silly? No, they've made an economic decision. Investment is there. Jobs are going to be involved. And no politician is going to undo that science now. We've won that battle. We're now ahead of the curve with respect to what has to be done. I am absolutely convinced we will get to a low carbon, no carbon economy. What I'm not convinced of is that we will get there in time to avoid what the scientists have warned us of, which is the worst consequences of the crisis. If you don't reduce emissions by 45% minimum by 2030, you can't get to net zero 2050. So it's on us right now. We are in the decade of decision and of, essential production of the actions necessary to achieve our goals.
You talked about the nuclear plants in Idaho. Do you feel, though, that nuclear energy still has a misconception around it?
Oh, of course. But it's not a misconception. If you put a nuclear plant right beside a fault line where you have a potential of a tsunami, you can invite a problem. But I believe nuclear is going to be part of this transition. Now, what happens with fusion may ultimately decide whether you have to rely on fission as an ongoing basis. A lot of it will be decided by cost and by ability to scale up. Right now, fusion is, and I'm repeating what I learned from the scientists, but somewhere in the 20 to 25, 30-year range before you may see it commercialized sufficiently to use it. But a lot of other things are happening that in the meantime allow us to avoid those worst consequences. Specifically, the IEA tells us that if we were just to deploy renewables, which we have at the level of technology we have today, we could at least get that 45 to 50% reduction and hold open the feasibility of achieving the net zero 2050 and keeping it to 1.5 degrees. So you can't emphasize enough how much things depend on what we decide to do and wind up doing right now.
Of course, the war in Ukraine is having a huge impact. How much of a threat do you think it is to the fight for climate?
Well, of course it's heavy. It's a terrible impact, and it's an impact way beyond just the gas that's been cut off from Russia and President Putin's weaponization of gas. It's hard for people to even digest the notion that in 2023, we're revisiting a kind of warfare and a kind of behavior that really the world had thought we'd put behind us. And that's tragic, and I think that has an overhang on a lot of things. But it also has a profound supply chain disruptive impact. It has a speculative impact. It has a very dramatic, everyday present impact in terms of fuel prices and the availability of fuel while we are in this transition. So it's the tragedy is those things I mentioned are just the exclamation points on the fundamental, profound tragedy of the way people are being treated, of this random warfare, of the treachery of those missiles, and the willingness of people to kill civilians as randomly as they are being killed.
Of course, you were Secretary of State under Obama. From your experience of President Putin, what do you feel his endgame is here?
I don't want to. I'm doing climate right now.
But of course it impacts the...
Yeah, and I spent a lot of time with Vladimir Putin when I was Secretary of State, and we managed to get a lot of things done. Yeah. Obviously, he is in a different frame of mind, in a different place, and there are different number of exigencies here that affect the possibilities. But it's going to be tough for a short period, I think, for sure, and all of us must hope for peace and try to find a way to get there.
What has been the most challenging aspect of your role as Special Envoy for Climate?
Making my flights on time. It's multilateral diplomacy is the hardest diplomacy. And there are 190 plus countries at stake here, and they all have a voice. And we have been coming together in meetings, trying to find the common ground with countries that have some very bitter differences. I think we've done a pretty damn good job of raising ambition on a global basis. When we started this, we were heading towards 3.5 degrees. And in Paris, we came down from 3. In Glasgow, the IEA tells us that if we did everything that was on the table that people promised to do, we could get to 1.8 degrees by 2050. And now after Sharm el-Sheikh, the measurement is that we could be at 1.7 degrees by 2050. But we're not doing everything we promised to do. That's the problem. And we're currently headed into the high 2s, somewhere in the mid 2s. But we still have the ability to turn that around. You know, the promise of Glasgow and the promise of Paris was not that this would be done next year. We have 7 years now to meet this target of 45% reduction. And so if we can keep deploying new technologies, if we keep pushing the curve on corporate response, corporations that have said, we're going to be net zero 2050, we're going to start now, we'll do our scope 1 emissions reductions, we're going to work on scope 2 and 3. I mean, there are a lot of things we can do. The biggest single restraint on our ability to win this battle, for certain, is the lack of money. The lack of money. Now, we're a $21 trillion economy, $22 trillion economy, and we're the richest country on the planet. And I personally do not think we're getting enough money from our various sources to be able to do this, and we're working at that. We're trying to push that curve. But if we don't deploy trillions of dollars of investment in the new energy economy, it's going to be very, very hard to win the fight. We're now creating new ways of deploying funding. We're trying to do blended finance with philanthropy. We're trying to, President Biden is committed to reforms of the multilateral development bank structure. That could make very concessionary funding available, which can then de-risk certain deals that could bring the private sector to the table to invest where they otherwise might not invest. But we have to accelerate all of that. That is where the real action is, in my judgment, right now, is getting money deployed so that we can scale up those technologies, discover the new products, the new methodologies, and win the battle. I do have a lot of confidence in just plain old human ingenuity. We're pretty good, you know, when our backs are against the wall. Witness what we did with COVID when government said, build us a vaccine.
Yep.
And they did it. And it made just a gigantic difference. Historically, we've done that many times, when we went to the moon, when we went into space. So I'm confident that if we will mobilize enough funding and generate enough economic activity around the explorations that need to take place, we can win the battle. We really can.
Just finally, Secretary Kerry, will you stay on in this role? For life? No. Not for life. I'm going to stay on for the foreseeable future and try and get some of these things done. I signed up for 1 year. I'm over 2, but we'll see where we go. Secretary Kerry, thank you so much for joining me today. Thank
Pleasure.
you so much.